Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. One of the things that we try to do here at the show from time to time is we try to talk to the smart people because the smart people know the things. And there's a lot going on in this province right now. We've seen some fascinating moves from Danielle Smith and the UCP in regards to not only some of the policies they're putting out lately, but the legislation as well. And there's a lot of rhetoric. There's hyperbole. There's concern. People are scared. We're getting close to the cats and dogs living together, I'm pretty sure. But in order to try to make some sense of this and to get some appropriate context and find out, should we be alarmed? That's a very inside baseball reference I'm making there. But to find out if we should be concerned, if we should be alarmed, we're very excited to welcome back to the show Dr. Lisa Young, who is a political scientist professor at the University of Calgary. She writes the What Now Substack and is legendary for her flowcharts, which offer a glimpse into the future, which I definitely will be asking about today. Dr. Young, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Happy to be here.
It's been a while since we've had you on the show, so I'm really glad that you agreed to come back. It means that we didn't do terribly last time, so I appreciate that. Um, Before we get into things, because there's three big pieces that I'm kind of wanting to talk to you about, and two of them I already mentioned in the preamble, and then the third one I was like, oh yeah, there's that one too. So I'll surprise you with that towards the end. But how's you're teaching in political science right now? How fascinating are the conversations in your classrooms? Because I imagine that right now is a wild time to have young minds eager to learn about the politics and going, there's this seismic stuff happening. So I'm curious, what are the conversations like in the classroom?
Well, it's interesting. I was teaching first year political science this year for the first time in like over a decade. And so it was, me with the, brand new students and people who are really new to studying politics. They don't necessarily know much about politics. And I've got to say, one of the things that's really different is that there's no sense that everybody has the same information about what's going on in the world, right? Even 10 years ago, it was pretty reasonable to think that, everyone had maybe watched the news or seen a newspaper. Today, no, even students who are really engaged are getting their information from different places, right? From social media, from podcasts, places like this. There's no reason to expect that anybody watched the CBC News last night, right? So that makes it a real challenge to teach. But it's also the challenge that we're having as a democracy, right? Here in Alberta, in Canada, pretty much anywhere in the world, that we aren't all starting with the same basic set of information necessarily, with the same set of facts and different perspectives on it. So that's been one thing that was really challenging. And then the other thing that's really challenging is how to talk about the things that I think matter. And that's going to be some of the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Questions of the health of our democracy, but in a very polarized context. And, I think it's really important as an educator that there's space in my classroom for all kinds of different political views. And so, how do I talk about these things that I think we should care about as citizens while still creating space for students who might have very different views about the politicians who are bringing this in, right? So, I think that's a challenge that lots of political scientists are having right now. And, if I had a formula for how to do it well, I would share it, but I'm still figuring it out. The best I can do is to say, there's room for different views here. I've got opinions, you've got opinions. In a democracy, people have different opinions and we exchange ideas, and that's how we move forward, right? And I keep coming back to that so that we can actually have these conversations.
I just want to clarify because you said something that was uh, dissonant for me in that you have a diversity of views in your political science classes. I was led to believe that there was only these left-wing progressive views coming out of post-secondary institutions. I'm terribly confused, Doctor.
No, there are, I'm here to tell you there's a wide range of views. And that is a good thing, right? I mean, I think it's my job as an educator to help people, of whatever view, learn how to articulate their ideas more clearly, how to ground them in information and logic, but not to convert them to my way of thinking. So I always start with, I've got a PowerPoint slide that I always use on the first day. I've got opinions, and so do you, and that's okay. And some of the students I engaged with the most in that first year political science course are people who are pretty distant from me ideologically, and we had good conversations.
Yeah, I think, and that's obviously I was a little tongue in cheek there, wildly off brand, but I think one of the things that's important to realize is that one of the things that strikes me that's been lost with this shared set of facts is the ability to have the conversations with people who have opposing views without flipping over the table and going home. It seems like the people who are most upset with the lack of diversity of views are the ones who want to flip over the tables and go home, and they don't have other people want to do that with them. But I'm digressing. I wanted to talk about your classroom a little bit in order to work my way into our first subject, which is going to be Bill 18. So rather than me try to screw up an introduction for what Bill 18 is and what does it means, I have a political science professor in front of me. I'm gonna ask you to do it.
Okay. Well, Bill 18, we thought was going to be legislation that said that municipalities could not make sign agreements directly with the federal government without the provincial government agreeing to it, signing off on them. But to everyone's great surprise, when on the day it was announced, it wasn't just the municipalities. It was also other provincial entities. So, I think organizations like the Alberta Energy Regulator are covered by this. But also the post-secondary institutions. And that was a real shock, I think, in some ways, because it really did suggest that potentially the government wanted to intervene in some of the internal matters of the university, some of the research that goes on, in a way that gets in the way of academic freedom, which isn't, and I'm going to stop right there and say, academic freedom isn't just, hey, I should be able to do anything I want. It's an idea that's deeply embedded in the idea of why we have universities, that you let people go where scholarship takes them to use their curiosity, because in a democracy, it's important to have a place where there can be free exchanges of ideas and people who push the boundaries. And academic freedom is intended to protect that. And so that's why people like me, university professors, get really concerned when we see something as potentially being getting in the way of academic freedom.
And I mean, I think it's interesting and important to highlight. I mean, you're being very generous in that, potentially this could be the government interfering. But Daniel Smith is on the record in multiple different places of saying, "Oh yeah, we're totally going to interfere." So it's not, I don't think, speculative at this point. But what's fascinating to me about the justifications for Daniel Smith saying that she feels the need to interfere with post-secondary institutions, the big area that she's talked about so far. And I think it's really important to put that caveat on the end of that sentence. But the big area that she's talked about so far has to do with research and grants. There's been a lot of conversation around that. I'm wondering if you can maybe summarize what Danielle Smith has said her concerns are and what your experience with, what's the word I'm looking for, reality is.
So I guess the first thing to say is that when we look at Bill 18 as it relates to the universities, really the only thing that it could touch would be research because um, what Bill 18 addresses is agreements between post-secondary institutions and the federal government. And the federal government doesn't get involved in funding universities, right? My salary to teach my classes doesn't come from federal money. What comes from federal money are the research grants that faculty members apply for and sometimes win. And so and the only agreements that are in place between post-secondary institutions and the federal government granting agencies are basically agreements that say, yeah, the University of Alberta or the University of Calgary is authorized to hold on to federal government money for faculty members who are doing this research, right? And so it's a standard agreement. Every university across the country that's able to hold research grants signs the same agreement. So to have the provincial government insert itself into that and then insist on, a right to veto the subject matter of the grants is really alarming. And when the legislation was first introduced, I saw that, I saw the potential for it, but I was like, hang on a second, take a deep breath. We don't know that this is really the intention here. And then, as you've said, the premier made a number of statements that really did suggest that there's nothing that she would like to do better than to get involved in the question of what can and cannot be a research grant held by an Alberta university. And so that was, at that point, it's like, yeah, okay, it's time to panic a little because this does potentially interfere with academic freedom. And so I don't think that this is going to come to pass. And the reason is that the federal granting agencies will not sign agreements, special agreements with Alberta universities that give the provincial government the right to say this one gets funded and that one doesn't. This would be a slippery slope. All of those research grants are adjudicated by groups of scholars in the field. They say, look, we've got these 50 applications. These are the ones that have the most merit. They're the most likely to move the discipline forward. We think that these are the ones that should get funded. They'll put them in order and say, okay, fund as far down as the budget goes, but we think this is the best one, this is the next best, and so on. So it's not the federal government that's saying, yes, there'll be research on this subject and not on that subject. And so that independence of those granting agencies really demands that there be freedom from political interference. And so they're not going to sign an agreement that gives a provincial government the right to interfere in that way. So, I just can't imagine that happening. So if the provincial government tried to pursue this, and they absolutely said, no, we're ripping up these agreements. I mean, the worst case scenario then is that Alberta universities can no longer hold tri-council money. Those are the granting agencies. And that would be an enormous blow. It would be millions of federal dollars not coming into the province. It would take these, really well-established, well-recognized research institutions, especially University of Alberta and University of Calgary, and make them far less successful or respected than they are today. It would destroy the institutions. So, is that something that the provincial government would be willing to do? Hard to say, but it would really be extraordinary if they did.
One of the things that I wanted to get your perspective on, because you operate in that realm of academia, is, it seems like Smith's positions have presupposed a few things. One of those presuppositions, it seems to me, is that oh, there's all of these people who are applying for ideological research projects, and they're somehow getting denied because of their ideological positions. And my understanding, and this is where I'm hoping that you can tell me how wrong I am, if I am, but my understanding of most research projects that go to these things, these tri-council things, is they're not ideological because they're in the pursuit of something empirical. So it's not a question of I'd like to do a study on why conservatism is the most awesomest form of awesome, and that's what I'd like to do. Also, progressivism sucks. It's not like people are bringing forward, I hope, those types of research projects. Am I getting it wrong? That's my
No,
first part, and I have a second part.
yeah, okay, sure. And I think, you're not getting it wrong. Research does need to be grounded in scholarly literature. It needs to ask questions. Most of it is empirical, although certainly, there's place for theory, right? And so I think by nature of the questions that are being asked, the topics that are being studied, it can certainly be seen as ideological in some ways, right? Somebody who's studying, in engineering, who's studying how to make solar panels more effective, um, they wouldn't think of their research as being ideological. But if you think that solar panels are inherently progressive, then I suppose you could say that that research project is ideological, right? By the same token, if it's research that talks about how the market allocates money efficiently, it's empirical or theoretical, it's grounded in the literature, but it does potentially lead to policy implications that say, yeah, you should have less government involvement here. So it's not that research is pure and can't be seen in ideological terms, but certainly, the notion that there are conservatives who are being consistently denied research grants because of their politics is I think implausible. And if that were to be happening, it would be a function of the adjudication mechanism, not the federal government itself getting involved, right? So there are all of the complexities of these things. And, at an anecdotal level, I can certainly point to many conservative minded colleagues who've done very well at the granting councils. So, it doesn't at that anecdotal level sit all that well with me either.
Yeah, I mean, Daniel Smith has cited two examples, both outside of the province of Alberta. So, super relevant to the conversation about what's going on in Alberta of people who have had their research proposals rejected. I find myself wondering though, like I'm a big Occam's razor kind of guy. And it seems to me that if you apply to a tri-council research granting group, I'm really good with terminology. If you apply to that group and say, I'd like to research X, and they say no, it would seem to me that somebody who's interested in academic rigor might view that rejection as, oh, I need to refine my proposal. I need to fix the things that got my proposal rejected. And if your first leap is, oh, you're doing it because I'm conservative, it could be that your proposal just sucked.
It could even be that your proposal was good, but it didn't make it to the top of the list. And the
Somebody was
reality,
better.
well, yeah, and the reality is that particularly in the social sciences and humanities, which is where a lot of the research that we're talking about really would be found, um, the success rate for research applications, for grant applications, is quite low. It can be a 25% success rate depending on the competition. And so that means that 75% of people didn't get funded. And, I think the normal reaction when you don't get funded is to look very carefully at the feedback that you get. And, is it possible that there are people who get feedback that, they interpret as being ideological? Sure, it's absolutely possible. But there's also often lots of feedback about, how you haven't grounded it sufficiently in the literature, or that your methodology wasn't rigorous enough, or that it wasn't original, right? That you weren't pursuing something that would actually make a contribution to knowledge. Writing grant applications is extraordinarily challenging. It's hard work, and it's rare to get funded on the first go round. And the other piece of the funding puzzle is that a good portion of the score on the adjudication is based on track record. So if you haven't published a lot, if you don't have a good record of, having an active research program, again, you're less likely to get funded, right? Especially in this highly competitive environment.
I mean, I have to say, when you were talking about like, and I realized that you were spitballing the numbers, but like 25% of grant applications get through, 75% don't. If the 75% that aren't getting through or being rejected because of ideological means, then that means theoretically that 75% of the people who are applying for grants are conservative, which means that you've got a lot of conservative people in the spaces. So what are we talking about even anymore? Uh, and I'm trying. I'm obviously being a little flippant with it, but it, when you said there are some people who would view solar panels as being ideological, um, my first thought was, what is the difference between a progressive solar panel and a conservative solar panel, other than one exists and one doesn't, arguably, which I suspect would
Yeah.
be the tone and tenor of the argument. Um,
Yeah, but I guess we've certainly seen a politicization of science, over the past 10 years, 20 years. So, um, people who are studying, there are um, geographers who go to the Arctic every summer and take ice cores because it helps them understand climate change over time, right? Um, is this ideological? You wouldn't think so, right? But to the extent that it might contribute to understanding of climate change, there are those who would see it then as ideological. And I think that's, you know, part of the mess we're in, when, science is seen as being um, driven by political considerations. But that's the broader context we're in. But I really think what we've seen is particularly from the right, not always, but often from the right, sort of an attack on science for coming forward with findings that are challenging to the status quo. All of the voluminous research on climate change, I think, is deeply threatening to some very powerful interests. COVID, we certainly saw the attacks on scientists. The whole controversy over vaccination and so on, and it really is this. It's this terrible moment that we're in where scientific progress has it lets us understand the world in ways that were unimaginable 50 years ago. And at the same time, we've got a substantial share of the population that is deeply skeptical of what science has to say. And that's the moment that we're in.
yeah, to me, I the it's so bizarre to me because one of the things that I always like to do is listen to the people who are smarter than me about the things that I don't know, because that way I don't have to know them. I can just go, other people are smarter. And to me, this whole argument of, well, our core samples from the Arctic are the ideological, or our solar panels ideological. That to me is like if there's a physicist who's standing outside of a building when a piano breaks free from the lift and it's about to fall on the person, and the physicist goes, "There's a piano. It's falling at this rate of speed from this height and this angle, and it's going to hit you with this amount of force." And the person standing directly under the piano goes, "I don't believe you." Like
Yeah.
it, it's wild to me. What are the implications for Bill 18? I mean, like one of the things that I found striking is we saw yesterday, and for the record, we're recording this on Tuesday, April 30th. But we saw yesterday there was a motion of sorts from the University of Alberta. One of the academic groups said, "Oh, this Bill 18 thing is very, very bad, and universities should be exempted from it, or it should be withdrawn entirely." But the response from post-secondary institutions, I mean, there's certainly been political scientists and other academics who have said, "Wow, this is really bad." But it seems like the institutions have kind of gone, "We're going to wait and see what happens." And there's been this sort of restrained response. And I'm curious, is there a concern that the the content of Bill 18 will have, regardless of what its outcome is, regardless of how it's utilized, is there a concern that this legislation will have a chilling effect on how freely academic institutions can academic institution?
Yeah, there's a lot there. And I guess there's a couple of things to say here. The first would be that much as academics, myself included, would really love to see the presidents of the universities shouting from the rooftops that this is not okay. I do understand why they're making the choice not to do that. I think that, certainly the experience in Alberta has been that quiet approaches to the government can be more effective than loud demonstrations. And so, on the one hand, we've got, academics themselves using collegial governance. So it was General Faculty Council, which is like the University Senate at U of A that voted this way. So that sends a message, right, from the academy. And presumably there are other quieter messages coming, through other channels to government to say, hold on, do you really understand what you're doing here? Here are some ways in the regulations that you can fix this, right? So I have no reason, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm willing to speculate that that's what's happening behind closed doors. So there's that piece. But then there's the bigger question that you asked, and that is, should we see this as potentially chilling what goes on in Alberta's universities? And I think that that's an important question to ask, because the premier's weekend tour after introducing this legislation, she went on all the talk shows that she could, and gave her view of what was going on in academic institutions and how there wasn't viewpoint diversity and so on. I think that certainly sent a message to universities that the government has post-secondary on its list and is going to be potentially prepared to interfere if it goes in a direction that they don't approve of. And I think there's already a lot of managing up that goes on between universities and the provincial government. Trying to make sure that the provincial government understands what universities do, trying to explain to them the value of having, wide ranges of views represented in the university. But I can imagine that at some point, there will be pressures placed on universities to, demonstrate alignment with provincial direction in a variety of ways. And it's a worrisome thing. I've been watching what's gone on in the United States fairly closely and with growing alarm. There's a concerted effort to shut down anything in the universities that relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Offices that are intended to make sure that universities are welcoming places for students of all races, of all genders, are seen as contrary to the interests of the state and are being systematically shut down. And I worry that we will see pressure in that direction here. And what I want to shout at government is that Alberta, Canada, is an increasingly and remarkably diverse place. We are, when I look at the students in my first year class, I see a very different Canada demographically than the one that I grew up in. And diverse societies don't just happen. They don't stay peaceful and they don't become equitable by not talking about it. And so the idea that there shouldn't be an office at the university that talks about diversity in hiring university professors, that talks about making your classroom an equitable and inviting place for students from a wide variety of backgrounds. The idea that you stop the universities from doing that isn't just an assault on academic freedom. It's actually taking away one of the mechanisms that we have for making Canada functional over the next 100 years. So it's just, it's a real worry that that's going to be the direction that the government goes. And up to this point, we haven't seen evidence of it. But one of the things I worry about at 2 a.m. when I'm awake.
It's fascinating to me because I've always sort of viewed post-secondary institutions or institutions of higher learning as sort of having two roles. One of them is sort of the instructive role, which would be the, hey kids, here's why the earth isn't flat. And that's all of the courses and everything. And then there is the role of academia and research, where in order to participate, it feels like, and I don't feel like this is a bad thing, to be clear. This is one of the reasons why I'm always nervous when I'm talking to folks like you, because if I get this wrong, I'm going to get told. But there's also sort of that debate that occurs where, yeah, we're not actually going to talk about whether or not the earth is flat or not. That's one of the prerequisites to being in this conversation, is you have to have at least gotten that far. And it's wild to me that more and more it seems like universities and institutions of higher learning, when it comes to relations with government, rather than having those, we're going to have the big kid conversations about the big kid issues. It's more, and this is why the earth isn't flat. And that's quite jarring to me, because these are the people who are making policy decisions that are not just going to affect the lives of Albertans today, but as you've alluded to, generational impacts. Um,
Yeah.
have I read the room entirely wrong, or?
No, and certainly there were some things, there are some things that we hear from government that suggest that universities have gone astray because we're not giving equal time to the idea that the earth is flat. Now that's at the extreme, but certainly, the idea that, we ought to be presenting evidence both that the climate is changing and maybe not, maybe, 98% of scientists have it wrong. That would be a terrible place if we were pushed to go there. So I think we've got to be really careful when politicians start pushing universities in terms of content.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's again, I just go back to that. Like, as you said earlier, with your I have opinions, everybody has opinions. Everybody has opinions, but the force and weight of a well-informed opinion versus the earth is flat, those are two very different things. And I think that part of the the discussion that should happen, this is just my speculation, I'm pontificating now, but part of the discussion that should be happening in that sort of instructional phase is here's how you get opinions, here's how you refine your opinions so they do have the force and weight of facts. And if you don't do that, then you won't be taken seriously by serious people. And what scares me is that we have people who are in serious people roles who are now saying, oh no, all perspectives are equal. And no, they're just not.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that we have to be teaching in post-secondary is how to understand things systematically. How do we ask questions and answer them systematically as opposed to anecdotally, right? So if you want to know if there's bias in research granting, you don't go and chat with a couple of disaffected professors who didn't get grants. You actually take a careful look at the publicly available descriptions of the research grants. You come up with measures that would measure bias or viewpoint or whatever it is you're interested in. You make sure that your measurement is in fact a valid way of measuring, and then you actually systematically look at the data set and figure out, is there bias or not? That's how we know things. And there seems to be, I think there's always a tendency, on both left and right to govern by anecdote, right? Stories matter to people. It convinces them in ways that sort of sterile presentations of data don't. But what we would want, I think, is governments maybe moved by the anecdote, but then asking the question systematically and asking for data.
With the anecdote piece, I feel like we've sort of put the cart before the horse because historically, if you want to convince somebody of a thing, one of the most effective ways to do that is tell a story that they can relate to. But it
Yeah.
starts because, hey, I've got this uh, amazing energy source thing and it's going to solve the world's energy problems, but I need people to get buy into it. So I'm going to tell them the story about how, hey, there's Timmy, and he can only turn his light bulb on for 5 minutes a day before the rolling brownouts in his country shut him off. And if we go with this amazing energy source, we could solve that problem. It seems like now what we're doing is we hear that one story and then we go, oh, that's indicative of not just the problem, but the solution. So instead of using the anecdote to reinforce the thing, we're using the thing to reinforce it's all very confusing. Um, any other thoughts on Bill 18 that you wanted to get out there? Because I want to talk about Bill 20.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that Bill 18 and Bill 20 should be seen as a package in some ways, especially I think we're going to start talking about municipalities. And um, I think if we want to understand what's really going on here, looking at the two of them together might be more effective than seeing them as entirely separate things.
Well, then let's get into the Bill 20. Um, what was your reaction to Bill 20 when it rolled out? Let's start with that.
So, right after the embargo came off, I was talking to a journalist who wanted some uh, some perspective on this, and I was expecting the political parties, right? That was what we expected to have. And the journalist I was speaking to started saying, well, here are some other things that are in it. And I might have said some things that weren't really quotable because some of what's in this bill is, I think, at best surprising and at worst almost shocking.
So what was the most surprising thing? And I mean, I'd love to know what the language that you used that you couldn't say. Uh, but what was the most surprising piece of Bill 20 for you?
Um, I would say that it's the combination of being able to require a municipal council to rescind a bylaw, just cabinet ordering them to do that, together with this idea that cabinet can also simply fire a municipal politician, or this really bizarre arrangement where cabinet can require a public vote on whether a municipal politician should be allowed to stay on in their role. And those three things taken together really do seem to give cabinet some extraordinary authority to overturn democratic processes that have taken place within the municipality.
So I want to talk about the bylaw piece first, because this has been a fascinating little narrative journey, let's say, because Rick McIver came out and he did his in no way condescending press conference, where he was asked, like, so why are you doing this bylaw thing? Like, you have the authority exists for the legislature to enact legislation to overturn bylaws. Why are you doing this? And he said, the first time in the press conference, he said, well, it's because, when COVID was a thing, and even though the premier of the province stood up and said that masking and health mandates should be municipal areas of jurisdiction because no size fits all, we changed our mind later when there was a leadership review. And so, if we tried to do that now, gosh, we might have to come back for a special session of the legislation, as if overturning a bylaw is just some light matter that should be able to be done through cabinet. So instead, we're going to say that we should just be able to do it through cabinet. But what was fascinating to me is that he also did a radio interview later on in the week where he was straight up asked, so, like, is this all because of that one thing? And his response was yes. So because of the once in a lifetime thing that was a pandemic, and because Jason Kenney had to do something that was politically expedient in order to increase his chances of surviving a leadership review, plus it came 2 weeks after the Coots blockade ended, which I feel like is probably relevant. Um, because of that, they're giving cabinet the sweeping power to remove any bylaw, because that way they don't have to reconvene the whole legislature. They can just do it, I guess, on a Zoom call. Um, how does that sit with you?
Yeah, when we look back at the decision to legislate that municipalities couldn't impose bylaws having to do with public health measures, I think that demonstrates it's a great example of the authority of the provincial government when it comes to municipalities, right? You can agree with it, disagree with it, but the provincial legislature was clearly within its authority to do that. And it went through the appropriate steps to say, we're passing a law, we're changing the Municipal Government Act and saying you can't do this anymore, right? So they had to reverse the quiet decision that they had made to allow municipalities to do this under these extraordinary circumstances. And that's still in in legislation, right? So without this, there was no reason to expect that if we had another pandemic, that municipalities would in fact be imposing their own mask mandates independently. So it's really overkill to say, okay, we put it in legislation, and now we're also going to give ourselves the power to say you can't do that again. So it's a strange answer from that point of view, because it's not even an authority, that particular example doesn't even apply anymore as a potential. And so it really does suggest that this is more than simply having to do with the potential of a pandemic, that it is an attempt to exercise quite a bit of influence over what municipal governments do or do not do. And I think here, knowing that cabinet has the authority to do this without going to the legislature and saying, yeah, we're passing legislation that prevents the city of Edmonton from doing X. What we do is that we create a situation where municipal governments have to look both at the voters who elected them to say, what do they want us to do under these circumstances? And also to look up at the municipal affairs ministry to say, are they going to let us do this? Do we actually have the scope, to make these kinds of changes? And, I suspect that there are having introduced this legislation while Calgary is in the midst of this very controversial set of hearings around changing zoning citywide, I think that there is an expectation in some quarters in Calgary that the first move that this is going to be used for is to overturn city council's decisions about zoning. Now that's speculation, right? But certainly I think there's excitement about this in some quarters in Calgary because of it. And that really does illustrate the potential of this legislation, that a city council will think, well, why should we take the heat for making a decision about zoning when we know that the provincial government is going to come and overturn it anyways? So for those people who are pushing us to do something, it's like, we'd love to, but the province is just going to veto us, right? And so then why are we electing city councillors, right? If they're just administering what the province of Alberta wants them to administer, how are they accountable to their constituents?
Which brings us to the other two pieces, because I think you got a word on your face there. But what and I want to talk about them separately, because there's the first piece that everybody's been talking about, and then as we talked about in the pre-interview a little bit, there's the second piece, and that's the one that has my real attention. So they've done all of this under the vague definition of public interest, which doesn't actually have a definition, which immediately makes me kind of squirrely, because if there's no thresholds for how we're going to use the power to remove bylaws, other than just to say public interest, ugh. But they're talking about more than that. They're talking about mechanisms to remove sitting councillors. So give me your high level thoughts on the first bill. We'll call it A, as if it's referred to as A in the actual legislation. What are your thoughts on the A piece of, I'll just fire you?
Yeah, I think in the normal course of events, it should not happen. If the voters have said, yes, we are going to elect this individual to sit as city councillor or as mayor, that the provincial government should respect the decisions of voters, even if they really, really dislike the person in that role. Now, there is a tricky set of circumstances here where, because the province is essentially responsible for the municipalities, it's created them through the Municipal Government Act, and there is that hierarchical relationship. I accept the idea that there are moments when the province might need to get involved. And I keep thinking here about Chestermere, where there was a city council, a couple of people in city council that were, I don't remember the details well enough, but there were some real issues with conduct. And so what the Alberta Municipal Affairs did was they sent in an independent investigator to figure out what was going on, someone who interviewed everybody involved. There was a report. It was made public. There was a process. None of this happened overnight, where the minister got angry and said, someone fire that mayor. But instead, there was a process put in place, right? And under those circumstances, once the information that had been made public was clear, you could see why the minister would, in fact, take this extraordinary step, right? Um, but none of those kinds of safeguards are built into this legislation. And, I think we've heard from the minister, oh, this would only be used in exceptional circumstances. But, ministers can change, circumstances can change, perspectives can change. And unless there are regulations put in place that put process around this, we're in a situation where the premier can blow a gasket at what the mayor of Calgary is doing and go to cabinet and say, let's fire the mayor of Calgary, right? And say that it's in the public interest. And I'm not sure what recourse there would be.
I mean, to me, that seems like the difference. It's really important to highlight, as you just did, that the powers, if there's somebody who's behaving really, really badly and it's counterproductive for the interests of the community, it's the look harm, there's illegality, rena. There are mechanisms that already exist for the provincial government to say, all right, that's enough out of you and dismiss people. Those powers have existed. It seems to me, and I'm hoping you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, that the difference between that and this is the current framework that was used to oust some folks from Chestermere is there has to be an investigation, there has to be evidence, all of that has to be made public. If you're going to, in effect, overwrite the democratic choice of the electorate, then you have to be able to justify it and make it public. This process is now, there's no requirement for any evidence, there's no requirement for anything to be made public. And the subtext of that to me seems to be that you can absolutely subvert the will of the electorate if it doesn't align with your views and you happen to be the one holding the power. Am I getting it wrong?
No, you're not getting it wrong. And I guess the other thing I would say is just like with this idea of requiring a council to rescind a bylaw, it's not just that the provincial government could actually do this, but it always has the threat available, right? And so if it wants to put pressure on a municipality to do something or not to do something, the conversation is no longer a conversation, a respectful conversation of, our perspective is that you should do X, and the municipality could respond with, well, we're trying to respond to our constituents who think that we should not do X. But with that sort of implied threat of, well, I can fire you. What kinds of pressure gets placed on municipal governments from the province?
Now, the other piece, and this is the one that is particularly fascinating to me because it seems that there's some political strategy baked into it, is the B column. And this is where the cabinet can direct a municipality to say, hey, you know what? We've heard from that Landon guy, yeah, Jody Gondek. Ah, she's just the worst. She's the worst. Landon said so. And he had like, I don't know, a couple thousand signatures. That's not nothing. That sounds like it's in the public interest. But hey, you know what? We don't want to be the ones to make that decision because we believe in democracy. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you know what? Hold a vote, Calgary. And then you guys can decide whether or not Mayor Gondek stays Mayor Gondek at great cost to the taxpayer, no less. But you can decide whether or not Mayor Gondek stays Mayor Gondek. And we're gonna give you the opportunity to exercise your democratic rights. There seems to be room for a lot of sort of craven politicking inside of that, but that's not the thing that people are talking about. And the question that I've been asking myself in the conversations that we've been having here with the team are we reading this entirely wrong, or is there like is this actually what it is? And nobody seems to be going, oh no, this is what it like. Are we getting it wrong? Please tell us we're getting it wrong.
I don't think you're getting it wrong.
Oh,
It's bizarre. I mean, it, first of all, it's so unusual. We don't even have a name for it, right? I mean, I don't know what to call it because it's not a recall, right? I mean, we
I've
know
got
what a
some
recall
names.
is.
I've got a couple of names.
I'm sure you do. It's not recall. It's sort of a referendum, but it's not really a referendum, right? Like, in what circumstances can you imagine the provincial government saying, okay, we're just going to have a little referendum on whether Jody Gondek can stay mayor, right? Like, it's just, again, the threat of doing this is, gives the province enormous leverage. And the reality of doing it is that you throw municipal governance into chaos, right? I mean, if the province were, tomorrow to say, yep, time for a vote on Gondek, we're just a little over a year away from an election. I have no idea what the rules would be around this, this vote, who can spend money, under what circumstances. It would make the mayor's office non-functional for a period of time. It might very well result in, having another election for mayor, hot on the heels of this, and then, the regularly scheduled municipal election. It's bizarre to think what this might look like in reality.
And there are no like this one of the thing the big questions is like because this is a new type of vote, there are no rules for it. So to my understanding, looking at the legislation, there's nothing that says that Danielle Smith can't say, well, you know what? I listened to Landon. The threshold for recall is too high. There is a public interest here. So we're going to put it to a vote because democracy. Um, and there's nothing to say that Danielle Smith in the UCP can't then mobilize the entire machinery of the UCP from the province to go down to Calgary and be like, oh yeah, we heard that Mayor Gondek. She's just terrible. You should totally vote her out. There's no firewalls to say this needs to be a conversation for the people that are actually going to be casting the votes. This could become the provincial news story for however long it needs to be. And I don't even think it even says in there like how long after the decision's made the vote has to be cast.
Yeah, I can't recall. I don't think it does. And this is another thing about both Bill 18 and Bill 20. The government has gone ahead and announced, okay, we're introducing this legislation, and if it's passed, it comes into force some time from now. And in the meantime, we'll consult and we'll come up with regulations, right? And so, on the one hand, that's a way to sort of damp down criticism of this, because it's like, oh, well, of course there'll be rules about that, but you have to wait and see what they are. You can't see them until the fall. So you don't know exactly what it is you're talking about, right? And this idea of sort of making your decision and consulting after the fact is also a little puzzling. But it really does make it difficult to understand what we're really talking about. And you have to ask yourself the question with these sorts of things: am I overreacting? Am I catastrophizing about what the government is trying to do here? And if we knew a little bit more, if we saw the draft regulations, we would be in a much better position to answer that question of, am I catastrophizing about this?
Rick McIver said multiple times, though, that the guardrails that will exist for whether or not to use this power will be the next provincial election because democracy is so important and ultimately elected officials are held accountable by the voters, which just makes me go, but you're doing this thing. Um, I guess the here's the question that I'll ask on the back of what you just said there. In your opinion, will Alberta be uh, more authoritarian under Bills 18 and 20 than if Bills 18 and 20 weren't things?
Um, I always want to be careful about using the word authoritarian,
As
right?
do I.
It's one of those words. I think it has to be a powerful word, right? You don't want to throw it around. Um, and certainly, I feel very comfortable saying yes, Alberta will be less democratic um, under these bills. And depending on what's in the regulations, I do see worries about, sort of a creeping authoritarianism here. Yes. Um, Democracy is hard to keep in good form. It's like a garden. It needs to be nurtured. And when you do things like potentially overturning the results of elections, it does in fact harm democracy. It makes people cynical about why they're bothering to go out to vote. It makes people not understand the assigned roles of government, and none of these things. It's not a coup. It's not somebody trying to resist the outcome of an election. It's not that sort of grand authoritarianism, but these small decisions that all add up, that try to weaken institutions like universities, that try to consolidate power in the provincial state, that try to make oppositional voices less loud, really do add up, I think, to a form of authoritarianism.
Yeah, it's we I have held my tongue on that word at the condemnation of more than a few folks for more than a couple of years, because there were people who didn't like what Jason Kenney was doing, but at least Jason Kenney painted inside of sort of the democratic norms that existed. He took his liberties and he was a political animal for sure, but there was still that sort of respect for the institutions. And what I'm afraid that we're seeing right now is the erosion of those institutions. And I think that the creeping authoritarianism piece is like, it really sucks to say. I never wanted in my lifetime to be saying I live in a place where there's creeping authoritarianism, and have some certainty to saying that. But yeah, I don't disagree with you at all there. Here's the question that I really want to ask, because I don't want to leave it on, hey, Alberta's turning into an authoritarian state, everybody. Have a great day. Because that feels a little uh, dark. But I think that there are some very real questions to be asked around how do we undamage this. And so by that, what I mean, I'm reading, and I'm in the process of reading an amazing book by Maria Ressa, who is a Nobel Prize winner, and she's a person of the highest character, is how I would describe her from what I know of her. And she writes a lot about some of the things that we're talking about today. And it has to do with that idea of shared facts. And I think one of the things that we've seen happen is, I mean, even you were talking about is at the beginning of the conversation, you have students coming in and there's sort of that like, okay, we got to all get on the same page, guys. At least on what are the foundational things that we agree on in order to have this discussion, to have this debate. Um, we've seen the erosion of that because we had social media come along and everything was driven by what's going to generate the most clicks. And then we saw media outlets adopt that same model, cough, Western Standard cough. I don't know what happened there. I had a little thing in my throat. And that has allowed for the proliferation of media outlets that are pursuing the most clicks as opposed to what is the most accurate version of the truth. And I think that there is something out there as true as objective truth. If the piano's falling off the building and the physicist says you might want to move, um, that's objectively true. Uh, how do we start to get those things back so that we can have those conversations? Because it seems to me that this erosion of our institutions and our norms has happened in no small part because of that, or that piece? How do we get to a place where we can have conversations with people where we are able to get to an agreed set of facts and go, okay, so we can all agree that the piano's bad. We should maybe not have the piano fall on us. How help, please?
Uh, I don't know. I don't know how we put the toothpaste back in the tube, you know? Um, certainly we can talk about the importance of education, media literacy, letting people, making citizens informed consumers of information. But I don't have any real confidence that that's enough. One of the most remarkable things to have watched over the past 4 or 5 years has been the extent to which a non-trivial segment of the population has just immersed itself in misinformation and disinformation because reality is so unpleasant to contemplate. And I think at some level, when we think about climate change and pandemics and so on, it's an understandable impulse to sort of reject the reality of it. Um, but I don't know how you fight back against that. I don't know that we have the tools, and I know that there are smarter people than I am who work on this and talk about it. Tim Caulfield. Certainly there are some answers there, but I'm not sure that we've got big picture answers to it. And it really is one of the questions for our time.
I was hoping for something more optimistic.
So, okay, I'm going to end on an optimistic note. I'm not answering a question that you've asked me, but at the beginning you talked about teaching, right? How do you teach political science these days? So, one of the assignments I gave my first year students was to read Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. And it talks about authoritarianism. It's very much grounded in 20th century history of communism and fascism in Russia and Germany. But it talks about it's 20 lessons essentially, things that individuals can do to try to protect democratic institutions. And so I gave students the option of writing about why Snyder was wrong, because there had to be space for that. But for students who didn't want to do that, the assignment was, okay, read this, pick one of these, and talk about how you're going to deal with this in your life, right? What can you do to try to protect democracy? And, there were some really interesting answers as people, young people really did engage and thought about this question of, if the idea is to defend an institution, what institution will I defend? How will I engage? How do I, you know, make sure that there's, that I'm basing my decisions in truth? So, there are tools out there. I think there are ways that we can engage. I'm not sure that we're going to bring everybody along on that, but it's certainly worth doing. And, it's possible that things get so bad in the United States that it's a real cautionary tale for us. Maybe it's a wake-up call.
So what I take from that is two things. The first one is everybody should go sign up for Dr. Young's first year poli sci class. Go do that now. Uh, and the second thing is there's there's value and hope in education there. Because if these kids, it hurts so much to say that, by the way. If these kids
Let
are
me tell you.
if these kids are coming up with institutions, they're able to define institutions that they want to protect, and they're able to define ways that they want to protect them. I'm just going to say, hey, everybody in our audience, you should go do that right now. Go do that assignment that Dr. Young just gave the Breakdowns audience, please. Um, And I hope that it doesn't come to a cautionary tale, because one of the things that's been striking to me as I've been reading the book by Maria Ressa is she has no shortage of cautionary tales. And it is not a big, if we don't have democracy, if we don't put the work in democracy, if we don't protect democracy, if we don't keep democracy healthy and water it every once in a while, then it's not a big jump from having a healthy democracy to, and this sounds dark, but quite literally beheadings in the street. And I don't think anybody wants that. So um, go read the book, do the assignment. We're going to be taking submissions, I think, here at the breakdown. Somehow I'll figure that out later. Dr. Young, anything else you want? That was a lovely piece to end it on. Anything else you want people to hear? Anything else you want people to know? And when can we? Can you please? I need a flow chart to give me some hope here.
Yeah, I have not done a flow chart since the provincial election.
I
It's
know.
I know. Okay, I will can be my summer project.
I keep looking for one, being like, there's options, there's routes. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And I have. What's your Substack? I know that you're not fond of the Twitter machine anymore.
That is
Wonderful place
true.
for discourse that it is. What's your Substack? Where do people find you?
It's What Now, an Alberta politics newsletter.
There we go. Um, Dr. Lisa Young, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat, and for confirming all of my worst fears. And, hopefully we'll be able to have you on again sometime soon when things have gotten better, because people will do the things needed to protect and water democracy and give it sunshine.
Let's hope.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.